Good day, John. How you doing?
Going great. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, good to have you on the show here. Yeah, today we have John Giles out of Australia. So, for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Oh boy. Yeah, I've been in IT for perhaps a little bit more than half a century. Started as a developer and then got passionate about data modeling a few decades ago and continue to be enthused by it. And I guess one of the things that Joe has come up is there still value in data modeling? And my answer is an enthusiastic yes.
This is awesome. Yeah, I think I found out about you. I'm not sure who recommended your book, The Nimble Elephant. It might have been in one of my Slack groups, but I read it and I was hooked, and I reached out to you and said, "Yeah, I mean, if you're open to having a discussion, I'm happy to do that." I thought it was one of the best books I've seen on data modeling, and your book, Elephant in the Fridge, is another awesome book. These are two wonderful books that I think are just a rarity in the industry. So thanks for writing them, first of all. So
Thank you, Joe. Yep. And hopefully, and I have had a little bit of feedback that it's not got just technical content, but
right.
hopefully is readable. I share a few stories and a joke or two on the way.
Oh, that's what I like about it. I mean, your writing style and the way you think it's very conversational, but in a way that when you read it, you can tell that you have really thought about these ideas too. It's not like you're just kind of pontificating. Actually, uh, you have a sense of humor when you write, which is kind of rare for data books in general. So thanks for that. I do like having I do like laughing when I read. It's fun. So that's cool. Yeah, but with data modeling, I mean, let's go back to kind of the beginning. I mean, you've been in IT, say, for half a century almost, and you got into data modeling a few decades ago. Like, what? And that's a long storied career to begin with. But what was that transition into data modeling? What was that spark?
Okay, I'll perhaps take, if I may, please, Joe, two ends of a continuum or close to the
Yeah.
end. Earlier on, a lot of data modeling related to physical,
Mm,
typically relational table design, and some developers, with some merit, would say, look, if they can see in their mind's eye what the physical database data structure is going to be, why spend time getting a modeling tool? Let's just create some tables. And in certain circumstances, there's actually merit in that perspective. But that is, if you like, focused, single project, physical. The other end of the scale, I guess, which I'm seeing more and more, is where you need to actually share data. You need to integrate data. And Joe, you're from the United States. There's an initiative that started almost 20 years ago. NIEM, the National Information Exchange Model. Now, it's not a data model in a relational term. It's not entities, attributes, and relationships in an ERD. It's XML with a JSON equivalent. It's an exchange model where various United States government, private enterprises need to exchange data. And it might be interesting reading for the people who
mm.
join the podcast, but that's, if you like, an American example of sharing data. So that's at a totally different scale to a project.
Interesting. Then I guess what are some of the impacts of sharing data that you wouldn't quite get with maybe a single project physical modeling approach? Like, why would we need to take a different approach with data modeling when we're sharing data?
Right. Okay. Well, a story coming out of a tragedy. The US and Australia and other countries have wildfires. I believe, particularly is it your southwest down California direction, you have bad fires. We likewise have fires. We had a bad one, and just in one afternoon, about 170 people died. So put that in America's population, that's probably the equivalent of 3,000 Americans dying.
Hmm.
So it was big, it was bad, and there was an inquiry, not witch hunt, but
Right.
just to see what we could learn and do better. So, to cut a long story short, human to human exchange as well as computer to computer exchange. One participant called fire trucks appliances. Another participant called them tankers or slip-ons. Tankers are the big ones. Slip-ons is where you slip on a water tank and pump onto a four-wheel drive tray. So in the middle of the crisis, they were tripping over terminology and exchange of data. And when you've got lives at stake, you can't afford to have this. So they wanted the Australian equivalent of your NIEM, but for fires. To avoid tripping up and misunderstanding on terminology and have efficient, consistent, repeatable exchange of data.
Yeah, I think when we first met, you were kind of going through some examples too. Maybe for the audience, can you go through some of the examples with the story about the fires? I think it was really interesting when people would call things certain, I guess, things, right? But it was very confusing for maybe some people who weren't familiar with that type of terminology, and it very possibly, it frustrated people at a minimum. It sounded like, but it also may have prolonged, that whole incident.
Yes, yeah. So the actual story from the fires is an incident controller said to one individual, "How many fire trucks have you got?" And he says, "Oh, we don't have fire trucks. We've got appliances." Um, he turned with a level of frustration and a little bit of colourful language, and he said to another agency, he said, "How many fire trucks or appliances do you have?" And the response, "We have neither. We've got tankers and slip-ons. Which do you want?" And his, I still love his response. He says, "I don't care what you bleep well call them. How many trucks that can squirt water have you got?" So we lightheartedly called them water squirting vehicles. That didn't stick, but it broke the ice on tension amongst people.
Yeah. I mean, bring it back to the enterprise, though, right? I mean, this is something where I think we see this often. I know, the classic example is customer, right? So you walk in
Yes.
any company, and there's probably I've never seen one definition of a customer really stick, and normally there's a bunch of interpretations of that depending on what department you're talking to or who in a department you're talking to, and so forth, and kind of brings it back to the notion of not just physical data modeling, but maybe something higher level. Maybe um, kind of cuts across a lot of different silos, maybe. So
Yep. Yep. So I'll run with the example, thank you, Joe, of customer. I did some work relatively recently for a life insurance, health insurance company. It not only provides insurance for medical bills, hospital bills, but it also actually provides dentists and optometrists under their banner at discounts. So and aged care facilities. So you ask them, what's a customer? One answer is the person paying the bill for the health insurance policy. And then you say, okay, but what if that's granddad because he's generous and the actual beneficiaries can't afford it? Are the beneficiaries the customers? And they go to the dentist. Mum is there and a child is in the dentist's chair. Who is the customer? Is it mum or the child? And then, excuse me, please, you're taking the aged care example. Is you've got an unfortunate example of a resident who's got Alzheimer's. Are they the customer, or is it the person who's acting with power of attorney? Now, you've got these sorts of questions, and the answers are not easy, but my passionate response, Joe, is just because it's not easy doesn't mean it's not important. You have to grapple with these things and say, you want to count the number of customers you've got. Please let's work together and get an agreed definition of what is a customer. Hard work sometimes. What is a product? Can also be an interesting debate. But if you're going to get meaningful results, for example, from an analytics platform, yes, Joe, you absolutely need the technology experts that can handle big data and have performant responses. Please, I am not downgrading the huge value of the technical skills required, but it needs to be balanced or matched with people who can work with the business to get agreement on the things you're counting, the things you're analysing.
That's interesting. It's something I've been thinking about a lot too. The sort of this modeling across the life cycle of data, and kind of where it hits different processes almost, right? And different processes might require different ways of morphing the data for its particular use case, right? But this is where I think, if you're assigned to a certain process, maybe that's writing an application that processes claims, for example, but that data also might be used in a data warehouse down the line. What I've noticed, and I'd love your take on this, it seems like people they're myopically focused on the physical aspect of modeling that claim processing application, and not considering the upstream or downstream consequences of that data. It's like, what do I need to do today to get this thing out? Kind of treating it like a single project, like you say, but I think also ignoring the sort of the continuum of that data that kind of flows like water, so to speak.
Yep. Okay. Oh, I'm enjoying this conversation. My mind's jumping in multiple directions. Okay, processes and domains. I believe
yeah.
Larry Burns quite well.
Yep.
I have huge respect for Larry. Delightful guy.
Yeah.
He tells the story, and I'm just taking this, where one business domain related, and I think it related to heavy vehicles, trucks. So one was sales of warranty type products. So that was, if you like, the upfront sales. But later you have claims against defects in the trucks, and the two parts of the business thought they were using the same language to refer to these warranties and claims and things, but they weren't. And now he tells the story better than me, but I guess what I'm trying to say, Joe, is you can carve the world. Let's take human beings. You can carve them according to young and old, or rich and poor, or English speaking and non-English speaking, all sorts of ways you can carve the world. Similarly, when you talk of domains, two of the ways you can carve the business. One is, I'm going to table three. One is business processes. Another is, if you like, the departmental view. You've got HR, you've got accounts, etc. But a way that I find often really helpful is to have data domains. So if you've got the concept of a customer, or a warranty, or a vehicle, or an asset, or whatever, these concepts span business processes. So if you can have a data view of the enterprise that can help different processes and different departmental views communicate and share data, that's massively valuable. I'm going to throw in something, and we can pursue it further if you like. Is people say, "Oh yes, but how long does it take to develop one of these views of the enterprise data?" And the answer is, it can take years and years and years. But the analogy I use is, if you have a town plan for a city that you plan to build, you can come up with a rough schematic town plan in days or weeks. And it won't go down to excruciating detail, Joe. It's just a town plan.
Right.
And I use the phrase sometimes, Joe, a data town plan, because some people, if you talk of conceptual data models, there's all sorts of debates about a
Yeah.
conceptual data model. So I try to defuse and say, let's have a data town plan with just enough detail to make the conversations and thought processes effective. And you can do a data town plan in days or weeks.
For the audience out there, how can they do that? I think that this is one of the nuggets, and this is when you first mentioned this to me the last time we spoke. I thought this was pretty brilliant and would be immensely useful. So,
Yep. Okay. How do you do it? I'm going to introduce one of my favourite topics, which is data model patterns. And again, two American authors, David Hay and Len Silverstone. David Hay, mid-1990s, published a book on data model patterns. Len Silverstone followed a few years later. And these data modeling patterns, what I love about them is they can be embraced by the technical people. You can actually implement these things, but you can also talk to the business about them. They understand what a product and a customer and a supplier and an asset is. Going back to customer, yeah, Joe, you're going to have some debates.
right.
But what I find is, if you take if you like, a palette of these data modeling patterns and just introduce them in a non-technical way to the business, you say you've got assets. Tell me about the assets. Oh, we've got these and these. And the data modeler says, oh, I've got subtypes here. And the data modeler is thinking in supertype subtypes. The business is just talking in terms of classification of its things. Have that conversation. Find out about the types of customers, types of products, types of assets, etc., and then how they interrelate. And I sometimes, Joe, talk of a model on a page. It's just a schematic. And in my book, The Elephant in the Fridge, there's some examples there. Just an A4 page. I'll tell a quick, delightful story. One of Australia's police forces went through this sort of exercise. It was a colleague, a friend of mine, who ran the exercise. It wasn't me. And they loved it so much. Back in the days when people had mouse mats, they actually made a mouse mat from this model on a page, and it was used to communicate the core assets of this police force. And it can be done. It can be done quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually had come across the notion of patterns from reading your books, and it feels like the and then I started reading the the data modeling patterns books, and these are what is data modeling resource books or whatever they are on Wiley, but these are fantastic resources. I mean, it's sort of a cheat code in a way. I felt like, because instead of going around investigating the business, I mean. And I think what you're alluding to is with these patterns, it's not like a retail business is fundamentally different from another retail business. I mean, there's certain operations that are pretty core to these types of businesses. If you don't fit these patterns, I would suspect you're either that smart and have considered a new business model that doesn't exist in the world, or you're crazy, one of the two. But as you point out, and you hit on this a lot in the Nimble Elephant, especially, where it's just use the patterns. These are recognized ways of viewing just how different things interact with each other. And the cool thing is, you had a few examples where I can't remember off the top of my head, but there were some patterns that translated between industries. Even you simply just drew the
Yeah.
lines differently, and it was like, okay, that works too. So
Yeah, so, oh boy, lots of responses to that. Firstly, just the published works of just David Hay and Len Silverstone, if you put them in a pile, it's about 2,000 pages worth
they're
of
big.
reading. And I'm probably a crazy sort of bloke. I've read them. um, Most people wouldn't. So if you go to my website, www.country, e.com.au, share it with your folk. There is a free download of a few dozen pages that is a succinct summary of the patterns. So if you like, for many people, Joe, that will be enough.
Sure.
That will get them going. They can engage with the business and talk at that level. If they want to drill deeper, I really encourage people who are passionate about this to buy the books by David and Len. But there's a free resource, and just a little tangent, one of the modelling tools called Ellie. If you sign up for Ellie, you can get a pre-populated version of Ellie with the content from the appendix of the elephant in the fridge, and there you are. It's free. So
Make a note to put that in the show notes here for the audience. So.
Yep. Okay, but I'll comment something else too on patterns. Two comments. Firstly, Len, as a rule of thumb, says you walk into any organisation in the world, and you've got a pretty good chance that 50% of that organisation's data needs are common with everybody else. They've got employees, they've got assets, they've got agreements, they've got events, the list goes on. So he's saying 50% of their data is common with everybody else, but they belong to an industry, manufacturing, retail, service provision, health, whatever. If you can get a model that reflects the industry, and please, I'm shying away from big, expensive industry data models. Please, that's not what I'm saying. Len has a whole book on patterns targeted at various industries. And he says you might get to 75% of this organisation's requirements, and then the other 25% is what makes them different, what gives them, Joe, a competitive advantage. So, hey, you've got 25% of data modelling still to do, but you get 75% somewhat for free. And this leads me on to the other point. Joe, these patterns are proven. They are flexible. They're robust, they're extensible, but they often have features that you might not need. But I suggest it's easier to start with this rich grab bag of options and throw away the bits you don't want, rather than start with an empty whiteboard, scratch your head and say, where are we going to start?
Right. So if you bring it back to the town plan too, like you wouldn't, you have a concept of what a town looks like. They have streets, municipalities and stuff. You wouldn't just design a town like you would like an amusement park, right? Like that'd be kind of strange. It wouldn't just fit. People just wouldn't understand what you're doing. So,
yep. I'll respond to that and say, just in the physical construction world, and I'm going to take cars as an example, there's patterns for nuts and bolts and spring washers and screws and everything. If you're building for NASA a Mars rover, you might individually engineer every bolt. You might. But hey, if you're designing a car, are they going to be 10 mil bolts or 8 mil bolts or quarter inch or whatever your unit of measure is? There's patterns for nuts and bolts and spring washers, screws, Phillips heads, etc. They're atomic patterns. Then there are what I call assembly patterns, which is for gearboxes, differentials, universals, the like. And there's variations. I sometimes take the universals and ask people how many or differentials, how many differentials in a car, and some will say one, and some will say two, some will say three, and they're all right. A standard car has one diff. A part-time four-wheel drive has two, a full-time four-wheel drive has three, but it's just reusing those assembly patterns in different ways. So yes, Joe, you can walk into a different industry and there will be patterns at different levels of grain that you can pick up and use.
It's amazing. Like I said, it opened my eyes to this whole world. That I mean, these books were written back in what the 90s or maybe early 2000s, right? So,
Yep, 1995, David Hay.
Yeah,
A series, a three-part series from Lim Silverstone in the 2000s. Yes.
yeah, and this sort of coincides too, because what I noticed is around like it was the early 2010s or so, it felt like data modeling as a practice really changed a bit. So I mean, in the in the application world, relational modeling was kind of what you did for a while, and then I think the introduction of NoSQL databases and streaming sort of just it felt like relational modeling was put on the back burner. In the analytics world, dimensional modeling, for example, which had been I think very popular, that was also sort of uh, eschewed. These are physical modeling practices, obviously. What I noticed is it seemed like the whole notion of modeling itself sort of became this kind of forgotten art in a lot of ways, right? But then, as I tell people, your lack of a data model is still a model. It might be a really crappy model, but you're still trying to represent reality or some aspect of what you're trying to do in data, and so you can reinvent the wheel every time you want to do this, or there are practices to do this. But even at what you're describing at a higher level, I mean, these are in my view like very lost but very valuable things that should be introduced.
So a couple of quick comments.
Yeah.
Graham Simpson has produced a book, Data Modeling Essentials, which, if people really want to get into data modeling, is a brilliant textbook. But one of the arguments he proposes, Joe, is that everybody, if you're going to have a developer, everybody does modeling. It's just like building a dog kennel. You might have engineered, architected drawings, or you might have it in your head. If you're building a house, you probably want engineers. If you're building a dog kennel, you do have a design. It's in your head. You haven't written on paper, but you do have it. If you've got a really good developer and they just start creating some tables, they actually do have a design. It just hasn't been articulated as a data model. But it is a model. A story, a true story, but a sad story. This goes back, I guess, to the value of having data models even in agile projects. So first story is a young developer based here in Australia was asked to develop some software for a school. Teachers, students, schedules, timetables, that sort of stuff. Now, he was young and delightfully naive. He assumed all families had mum, dad, and some kids, and the children all that the whole family lived in the family home, and they all shared the same surname. Okay, life is a little bit richer than that, but he developed a data model and built some tables. And I'm going to cut a long story short. There was one of the families that attended the school where mum and dad had separated because there was domestic violence was part of the situation. Mum and kids were in a refuge whose address was highly protected because people are at risk. Because, long story short, because of this assumption that mum and dad live at the same address, and the way it was implemented, this violent individual now had the address of the woman's refuge where his wife
Oh
lived,
boy.
and all hell broke loose. Now, that's a bad outcome. So why am I telling this? We go back to data model patterns, the party role pattern that
Mm.
Joe, some people love, some hate. I'm going to put that debate aside, if I may, for the moment. But it has this flexibility. It says you've got a person. Do they have more than one address? Do they have more than one name? Is that address shared by other people? So these sorts of questions, if this developer had have grappled with the model, I suspect he may have realised that his assumption that mum, dad, and the kids all share the same surname and share the same address may have been challenged. So, so that's a quick story on being challenged by the flexibility of the patterns to think about whether a subset will suit you. The other story I got from an agile coach. I didn't Scrum Master, whatever his title was. He was on a project, and the velocity, the number of points delivered per sprint, was reducing. Their productivity was getting worse and worse and worse. They said, what's going wrong? Sprint 1, they had some physical tables and some code, delivered it. Sprint 2, new functionality, but some changes to what they'd already built. So they had to change the data structure and therefore recode and retest elements from Sprint 1. Sprint 3 changes to the underlying data structure, which meant recoding and retesting elements from Sprints 1 and 2. Sprint 4, you can see the pattern. And the Scrum Master called a halt and he said, we're going to get a data modeler in on the project who will look ahead at least one sprint ahead of where we are, preferably have what I will call a town plan, a bit of a vision of where we're going, and their productivity went up 13-fold. They delivered 13 times the number of points per sprint on average from then on. Can data modeling deliver value? I think so.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. It's why do you think this is so difficult though for data teams and developers to do? Because I feel like this shouldn't be that hard, right? Or maybe not hard is the right word, but I would think that just being able to I guess do data modeling in a maybe more thoughtful capacity is something that I would expect people to do, but it definitely doesn't seem that way from where I sit. I mean, what are some of the challenges you've seen in making data modeling work?
Okay, I think in part, I don't know what American universities are like, but Australian universities, they either don't teach data modeling, or if they do, it is terribly mechanical, Joe. First normal form, second normal form, third normal form, which, by the way, isn't fully normalised, but that's another discussion. And that's what they teach. And people go out and think, well, that was useless, and throw it in the bin.
It's similar in the States. It's similar to what I've seen.
Right. Another thing too, and look, I'm not a psychologist or whatever, but my observation is that you get some brilliant technical people who feel less comfortable interacting with the business. You know, they're happy cutting code. Don't put me in front of C-level executives, please. That's not my scene. And please, Joe, I'm not being critical. We all come in different boxes, different shapes and sizes. But what I'm saying is that some technical people would rather leave the business interaction to others. So I think that's in part an issue. And then from the other side, I think of one individual who I'm certainly not going to name, but he was comfortable interacting with the business, but he had never developed anything or been on a development team, and he was making decisions and recommendations about concepts that were soft and woolly and fluffy and could not be implemented.
Mm.
So what's the solution, Joe? You're probably going to smile at this. Data modeling patterns, they're implementable, and you can talk to the business about customers' assets, agreements, events, tasks, etc. So I think that in part is the answer. But going back, why don't people do it? They've probably seen examples, Joe, where there's been investment that hasn't delivered tangible value. And they just think, yeah, we'll do without it. But I contrast that with my own experience. Again, this goes back to town planning, Joe, doing enough. And for those who are going to be listening to the podcast, Chapter 3 of The Elephant in the Fridge. Elephant in the Fridge is aimed at the Data Vault community. If you're not interested in Data Vault, throw away the rest of the book, read Chapter 3. It tells you how to do a town plan. But I did some work for a big Australian telecommunications company, worked with one guy. He went to another telco, and he said, John, I've seen what you've done. Can you come and do it? Now, the earlier telco had had a team of people for 5 years doing the enterprise data model. And he said, John, I want you to do the same, but for my new employer, and you've got 2 weeks and you're doing it on your own. And I laughed and joked with him. I said, I can save you 2 weeks. Buy Len Silverstone's volume number 2, go to the chapter on telco. It'll cost you $200. Job done, you don't need me. And he laughed. He said, no, come on, John, we'll take you on board. Which we did sufficient modelling so that they could have a common foundation for 3 projects that they were launching in 2 weeks' time. One of the guys there went to another organisation, and this was the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. It's the register, Joe, of doctors, nurses, chiropractors, dentists, optometrists, etc. I assume in the US, people can't just say, I'm a dentist and start practicing. They actually have to be qualified.
That would be bad. Yes, that's
so.
not allowed. That's not allowed here. Surprisingly enough, it is America, but you can't do that. Nope.
So they had a register, and they needed some data analytics. They said, we need to pull together data. Now, we've got less states than the United States. You've got 50, I think, is it? We've got, a lot less than that. But each state had databases and applications, one for doctors, one for dentists, one for chiropractors, and they had to pull together 80 source systems and produce one consolidated view. And I was given 3 weeks to do that. And I did it. One of the guys there went to another company, a water utility. So telco, health registration. Now, water utility, one of the guys there saw what I did, and he said, can you come and spend a few weeks and do a town plan for us? And Joe, for those who are listening, I hope you get the feeling, I actually enjoy this. It's fun. You're dealing with the best and brightest, business and IT, getting them on the same page. They get enthusiastic and they deliver value.
That's crazy. And the thing is, you look awesome because you're fast, and so it's almost like you're too good at your job, but you're using the patterns, right? So.
Yep. Yes. Well, a phrase that I guess makes me smile is, if you want to see a fast way of doing something, observe a lazy person. Ah. But seriously, a more complimentary thing is if I can see further than some, it's because I stand on the shoulder of giants.
Right.
So, yeah, leverage the data modeling patterns, get data modelers on board in your projects, even agile projects. I told you about the 13-fold increase.
Hmm.
Um, get people in who preferably are familiar with the patterns. If not, as I say, my introduction is free. Get it, read it, dig deeper if you want to.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I have the uh those books on my iPad, which is unfortunate because, as you say, there's 2,000 pages, and reading 2,000 pages on an iPad is, I think, a very hateful experience, to put it lightly. So I'm gonna have to go out. I think I'm gonna have to buckle down and get the physical books. But um, yeah, but I can't imagine what it would have been like to write those, because it's 3 volumes, and
Yeah.
these aren't small books. And so, I mean, I've written one book that was 450 pages, and I think that was a lot. But to write something that's bigger and times 3 is, and just the thought process, because this is all a lot of new thinking back when these books were written. These hadn't, nobody had really taken the time, I think, to dissect what are the patterns in a
Yep.
business that relates to data. That's monumental stuff. So
Yep. Yep. I absolutely take my hat off to people, and I've mentioned David and Len, but
yeah.
for example, in the object-oriented community, there's a lot of talk about patterns. What is it? Gamma Helm, Johnson, and Vlacides have got design patterns, so they're a different type of pattern. But then there's others within the OO community who have what are closer to data modeling patterns.
Mhm.
And this is a little tangent. What is a data model? I was interacting, Joe, you're familiar with this. I was interacting recently with a fellow Australian who has taken an interest in data modeling patterns. Now, his focus was on patterns for what I will call data warehousing business intelligence.
Mhm.
And he looked at the works of Bill Inmon, Ralph Kimball. So, your so-called 3 and F, your dimensional. Um, he looked at Dan Linstead and Data Vault. So he came up with, I think, 3 different styles of patterns, but they were focused largely on what I will loosely call the data warehousing space.
Yeah.
And that is completely legitimate. But then, Joe, you've got data modeling for information exchange, and your American NIEM is a beautiful example. It's in XML. I've looked at it, and there's some aspects of it I think, oh, scratch my head, I might have done it differently, but at least you've got something you can start talking about. But that's patterns for exchange. Then you've got object-oriented development, where people might do, for example, UML class models, and the OO people will quite correctly say that a class model and a data model are different animals, and yet a number of times I've used a subset of class modeling to capture the thinking for a data model. I know
Mhm.
it's that the OO purists will perhaps say, John, you're using that modeling notation for a purpose for which it was not intended. But if you've got a modeling tool, and there's one that some people might be familiar with, Sparks Enterprise Architect, it costs a couple of $100. It's got heaps and heaps of notations. One of them is class modeling, and for $200 for a seat, you've got a tool that can be used quite effectively for a data model. So, Joe, I've touched on a whole heap of issues there, on data modeling, notation, and what you use it for.
Well, and these all have knock-on effects on each other, right? I think earlier we were talking about just the data life cycle and the fact that data is not a static thing. What I've noticed is, okay, so in the object-oriented world, you have I don't see too many people using UML these days, but I think almost anyone is making applications. There's some notion of like well, not everybody, but if you're using a lot of popular frameworks like Ruby on Rails, Django, whatever, I mean, these have an object relational mapper, right? Object oriented notation to translate into a database. And the amount of, I would say, denormalized data that occurs almost, on accident, I would hope, but it's so easy to do, is because these object relational mappers are so tied to the database and have consequences in terms of even the views for these applications, right? Some auto view controller or some variant of that. What often happens is the data that's in the transactional database is now it's some sort of a form. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's lots of duplications. At a certain point with scale, your database would probably keel over because it's doing a lot of unnatural acts. But this is the object oriented world. It allows you to you can do this. Obviously, if you're diagramming it out, hopefully you'll avoid these mistakes. But the consequence of this is typically data warehouse teams, analysts pull this data in and try and make sense of it. And geez, lo and behold, why is data so hard to reconcile now? Well, because upstream, it started out with good intentions and it became a bit of a mess, and here we are today. And so,
Yep.
but what I haven't seen is people don't diagram this typically, right? It's like I need a new field added to this form. Oh, the easy thing to do is add it to the database so I can populate, the form and make it work. And that's it's a level of convenience that I think people don't understand the consequences of what happens.
I'm smiling, Joe. Back some decades ago, the 1970s, when I was doing a lot of programming, I saw people who would design a data structure because the business wanted a report. This is before you had report writers and Tableau and all sorts of things. And they would structure the data structure based on the report that was required. Terribly narrow thinking. And some wise old heads would come along and beat them up and say, no, don't design the data structures just for that one report. Let's design them around reusable concepts. I think, Joe, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's too easy, instead of a hard copy report, to have a form on a screen and have a data structure to support the form, instead of saying, how else might this data be used? Might somebody else have already captured this data? And look, I'll tell a really quick story. I'm full of stories. But I worked for an airline, and two development teams. One was recording the skills of the air crew, and it went from competency to fly a 747 through to the people in the cabin. Could they speak Japanese, English, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever? So basically the skills of the people who were on board the aircraft. Then there's the HR department, who had employees and who's got an accounting degree and who can write SQL or whatever. And they said, hang on, we're both recording data about employees and we're both recording data about skills. Why don't we have two? This was IBM's DB2. Why don't we have two relational tables, one for employees and one for skills, and two projects share two tables? All it requires, Joe, is the conversation, and for developers to realise they are part of a larger team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you usually don't find out until things like that, right? So, but again, hopefully these silos get broken down. But I was talking to Bill Inman last week. We were doing an event in Denver, And somebody asked him, what's the biggest struggle he's seen in his career, and it's always been it's kind of the separation of the business and IT, right? And he actually called it a divorce, so to speak. And I thought that was a bit of a strong term, but I think it's not wrong either. Yeah, because it's you think a lot of these, just by simple conversation, you can figure this out, right? This is like a 5-minute chat, like, okay, people, skills, whatever. But then it multiplies itself too, because dev doesn't talk to quote data doesn't talk to people downstream either, and so it's just this constant guessing game, and it's like I said, it has interesting consequences. So
Yep. So one of the things, Joe, I love about Agile is the idea of co-location of the product owner, your business people, and the developers. Love it. The danger I see is if they are totally project focused on a single project, without perhaps just having that short conversation, like the example I just gave of flight crew and employees. Have we got an opportunity for win-win for the larger good? Just have that conversation.
I love that. It's a beautiful place to wrap it up too. But yeah, I hope that ideal happens. It just, because if you take a step back and understand that the data model is for the greater good of the organization, cohesive data model, that's something we're striving for. So thanks for the conversation. I always like talking to you. I feel like I get smarter, and hopefully a bit of your wisdom rubs off. So.
Well, just one parting thought. Getting the enterprise view. I've mentioned emergency response to wildfires.
Yeah.
What is the organisation? For the answer to that was there was 17 organisations in our part of the world. So hopefully you don't want the ambulance, but they are one of the 17. Hopefully you don't want the state police force, but they are one of the 17. Okay, so the organisation, the enterprise for emergency response, was a virtual organisation that formed for the duration of the emergency. So the answer to that case was the enterprise was much bigger than anyone. And then the opposite of that is did some work for I'll mention them, Salvation Army, and I'll put it that they had, if you like, the church side and they had the social side. So the question was, are they two separate organisations within one? So without going into the answers to that, because it was shades of grey, but what I'm saying, when you talk of the enterprise view, have a talk with the business and get their definition on the scope and definition of the enterprise. It might surprise you.
Yeah, certainly. And it's always, in these conversations I have with the business, there's always this, I don't know if you notice this, but it's there's always like a sentence that somebody says. It's a really subtle thing. So you have to be good at listening, right? But there's always something somebody says, you're just like, oh, that's the that would be important to note, right? So it's always like a really subtle thing that kind of changes the dynamic of what you think you're talking about. So
I'm about to laugh. Did some work for a big Australian mining company, and I flew in, and they had scheduled back-to-back 1-hour meetings, 4 hours lunch, 4 hours solid for a week. So I had 40 one-on-one interviews with people. I got to the end of the week, and I said, because my thinking was, guys, we should have got together much earlier. But I said we need to get together, and I seeded the conversation. I would drop a question in and say, look, I think I may have misunderstood something. I'm hearing something that sounds a little bit different. I was trying to be gentle, and I'd drop it in. It was like pulling the pin from a hand grenade, and boom, at the end of a conversation where all of these people were were together, one of them came up to me and he said, I have worked for this company for decades, and I didn't realise until today that other people saw us differently.
Wow.
But yeah, so it was a fiery thing, but it was brilliant and a wonderful outcome.
That's awesome. Well, John, it's been a great discussion with you. I guess for people who want to learn more about you or your writings, how can they do that?
Oh, I guess the two books, The Nimble Elephant and The Elephant in the Fridge. My website's got a little bit of free material. TDAN, the Data Administrator newsletter, just jump on it. And do a search for Top Down, which is taking the overall business-centric view. You'll find I've got a few articles there. So there's just some things to perhaps get people going, Joe.
Awesome. Cool. And I'll put those all in the show notes. Well, John, thank you for your time. Like I said, I always feel like I come away, slightly wiser talking to you. I'm sure more conversations will make me that much better. But hopefully, the audience, learned a thing or two. I think the notion of data model patterns is just something that I think people need to rediscover.
Yep, real good return on investment. And look, thank you, Joe. I've had fun interacting with you. Keep up the good work you're doing in keeping the communication going. Thank you for inviting me.
Anytime. Cool. Thanks, John. Take care.
Thank you. Right.